I have full confidence in Catherine and William. Their judgment is sound, their loyalty unquestionable.
There are moments in royal history that are announced with celebration, and then there are moments that remain hidden behind palace walls until whispers become impossible to ignore. This may be one of those moments. According to growing speculation inside royal circles, King Charles recently approved a confidential royal document that could quietly reshape Prince William's future long before Britain ever expects it. There are no cameras waiting outside Buckingham Palace, no official press conference, no cheering crowds, just a private decision that has sparked questions throughout the United Kingdom and beyond. If those reports are true, the document isn't about replacing a king overnight. It's about preparing the monarchy for a future no one wants to face, but everyone knows will eventually arrive. And what makes this story even more fascinating is the emotional weight behind it. For King Charles, every step toward preparing William means confronting the reality of his own reign. For William, every new responsibility brings him closer to a destiny that comes with both honor and heartbreak. So what exactly was signed? Why was it handled in complete secrecy? And how did Catherine, Camilla, and Princess and become connected to one of the most talked about royal stories of the year? Stay with us, because what unfolds next may completely change the way you see the future of the British monarchy. The atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace felt unusually different that morning. Staff members moved through familiar corridors with quieter voices, and even experienced royal aides sensed that something important was unfolding behind closed doors. Nothing had been announced to the public, yet the mood inside the palace suggested that an important decision had already been made. King Charles arrived carrying a slim leather folder marked for restricted royal access. It wasn't unusual for the monarch to review confidential documents, but those closest to the situation immediately noticed something different. Security procedures were tightened, private offices were cleared, and only a handful of trusted advisors remained inside the room. Outside those walls, London carried on as always. Tourists gathered outside Buckingham Palace taking photographs, unaware that a quiet meeting inside could eventually influence the future direction of the monarchy. The discussion centered on Prince William. Not today's duties, not next week's schedule, his future. For decades, William has lived with the certainty that one day he will become king. Yet knowing your destiny and preparing for it are two very different things. Every reigning monarch eventually faces a difficult responsibility, not simply ruling the country, but making sure the crown remains stable long after they are gone. King Charles understood that responsibility better than anyone alive. Having waited most of his own life to become king, he knew how quickly circumstances could change. Unexpected events had shaped previous generations of the royal family, and history had repeatedly proven that preparation often mattered more than prediction. As the meeting began, one advisor carefully placed several confidential files on the polished table. These documents reportedly outlined future constitutional procedures, emergency communication protocols, and expanded responsibilities that could gradually be introduced to the Prince of Wales if circumstances ever demanded it. Nothing in the room suggested an immediate transfer of power. Instead, the conversation focused on readiness. Charles listened carefully as senior advisors reviewed every possibility. They spoke about continuity, stability, and ensuring that Britain's constitutional system could function smoothly during any unexpected national situation. For several minutes, the king remained completely silent. He slowly turned each page, occasionally making notes, occasionally asking questions. Then he reached one particular document. Unlike the others, this file dealt specifically with Prince William. Several advisors exchanged brief glances. They had spent months reviewing possible recommendations before presenting them to the monarch, knowing that whatever decision Charles reached would carry enormous symbolic importance inside royal circles. The proposal was simple in principle, but emotionally difficult. It recommended gradually expanding William's access to confidential state information, allowing him to become increasingly familiar with responsibilities normally reserved for the sovereign. The recommendation wasn't based on fear. It was based on preparation. King Charles understood that leadership could never rely on hope alone. History had taught every monarch that unforeseen circumstances often arrived without warning. For nearly a minute, no one spoke. The king rested his hand on the document, staring through the palace windows toward the gardens outside. Perhaps he wasn't thinking about paperwork. Perhaps he was thinking about family. Because every official document carried another meaning. Every new responsibility given to William also reminded Charles that time never stopped moving forward. Finally, he picked up his pen. Without ceremony, without photographers, without television cameras, he quietly signed the authorization before sliding the document back across the table. No applause followed. No announcement was prepared. The meeting simply continued. But everyone inside that room understood they had just witnessed something significant. Meanwhile, Prince William knew absolutely nothing about what had taken place. His own schedule that morning had been filled with charitable engagements and meetings connected to environmental initiatives. Alongside Catherine, he continued representing the monarchy exactly as the public expected, calm, confident, and focused. Nothing suggested that confidential discussions concerning his future had just concluded inside Buckingham Palace. Later that afternoon, however, everything changed. William received an unexpected request asking him to return to Windsor as soon as possible. There was no explanation, no details, only a message stating that the king wished to meet privately. Catherine immediately noticed the expression on her husband's face. She had spent enough years beside William to recognize when something unusual had happened. "What is it?" she quietly asked. William looked down at the message once more before slipping his phone into his pocket. "I'm not sure," he replied. "But whatever this is, it couldn't wait." The drive to Windsor felt unusually long. Neither William nor Catherine spoke very much. The silence itself seemed louder than conversation. Questions continued building inside William's mind. Had something happened concerning government business? Was the king unwell? Or was this connected to responsibilities that had never previously been discussed? By the time their vehicle approached Windsor Castle, palace staff were already waiting. William was escorted inside immediately. Catherine remained behind, watching as the heavy doors slowly closed. She couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting was different from every royal briefing that had come before. Inside one of the castle's private sitting rooms, King Charles waited alone. No advisors, no officials, no cameras, just father and son. For several quiet moments, neither man spoke. The silence carried years of shared experience, duty, and understanding. Finally, Charles reached toward the same leather folder that had remained beside him throughout the afternoon. He gently placed it on the table between them. William looked at it, then back at his father. Without opening the file, he quietly asked the question that had already begun forming in his mind. What exactly has happened? Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly into his son's eyes before calmly saying, "There are some responsibilities no father wants to discuss with his son, but every king eventually must." And with those words, the conversation that could shape the future of the British monarchy quietly began. King Charles remained silent for several seconds, allowing the weight of the moment to settle between them. The folder rested untouched on the table, yet William couldn't take his eyes off it. Throughout his entire life, every important conversation inside the royal family had carried meaning beyond the words themselves. This felt different, more personal, more permanent. Finally, Charles slid the folder toward his son. "I believe you're ready to understand why this was necessary." William slowly opened the cover. Inside were several carefully organized documents, each outlining future responsibilities connected to the role he would one day inherit. They weren't instructions for becoming king tomorrow. Instead, they described how knowledge, security briefings, and constitutional preparation could gradually expand while Charles remained firmly on the throne. William looked back at his father. "So, this isn't about succession?" Charles shook his head. "No, it's about ensuring the institution never finds itself unprepared." The king's voice remained calm, but William could hear the emotion beneath every carefully chosen word. "For generations," Charles continued, Our family has learned that stability isn't created during a crisis. It's created long before one ever arrives. William understood the logic. He had represented the crown across Britain and around the world for years. He had met presidents, prime ministers, military leaders, volunteers, charities, and thousands of ordinary citizens. Yet there were still areas of royal responsibility that remained beyond his reach. Sensitive government briefings, certain constitutional discussions, private communications reserved only for the reigning sovereign. Charles explained that the newly approved framework would gradually change that. Not overnight, not publicly, but carefully, step by step. The prince quietly turned another page. Each document outlined situations in which he could receive additional information, participate in confidential meetings, and become more closely involved in national continuity planning if ever requested. Nothing removed authority from the king. Instead, everything strengthened the bridge between one reign and the next. William finally spoke. "You've been planning this for some time." Charles gave a small nod. "Longer than you probably imagine." The answer surprised William. He had assumed the meeting resulted from recent discussions. Instead, it appeared months of careful planning had already taken place behind palace walls. "What changed?" William asked. The king leaned back in his chair. "There was a moment recently when I realized how easily uncertainty could appear." Charles described an official engagement that had exposed a weakness within the traditional flow of royal information. Nothing dramatic had happened publicly, but internally, several senior officials recognized that communication during an unexpected situation could become unnecessarily complicated. The experience stayed with him, not because anyone had failed, but because preparation could always improve. William listened without interruption. He knew his father rarely discussed private concerns openly. For Charles to admit uncertainty at all spoke volumes. "I don't want history forcing decisions upon us," the king continued quietly. "I'd rather we prepare while we still have the luxury of time." Those words lingered in the room. William suddenly understood that this conversation wasn't really about documents. It was about responsibility and trust. Back at Adelaide Cottage, Catherine noticed how unusually quiet the evening had become. William had returned home carrying the leather folder, but had barely spoken during the drive. He placed it carefully on a nearby table before staring out toward the gardens. Catherine walked over without saying anything. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence invited honesty better than questions. Eventually, William broke the silence. "My father showed me something today." She waited. "He wants me to begin preparing differently." Catherine looked toward the closed folder. "Does that worry you?" William thought for several moments. "I'm not afraid of responsibility." He paused. "I'm afraid of what responsibility represents." Catherine immediately understood. Every additional duty brought William one step closer to becoming king. And becoming king inevitably meant one heartbreaking reality. His father's reign would one day come to an end. She gently reached for his hand. "You've spent your entire life preparing to serve." William nodded. "I know, but preparation somehow feels different when it stops being theoretical." Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, another important conversation had already begun. Princess Anne arrived carrying several briefing papers of her own. Unlike many members of the royal family, and had built a reputation for approaching difficult situations with remarkable honesty. She wasn't interested in appearances. She focused on duty. Charles welcomed his sister into the room. Neither needed lengthy introductions, and placed the documents on the king's desk. "I've reviewed everything." Charles studied her expression. "And I think you made the right decision." The king remained thoughtful. "There will be questions." "There always are," Anne answered. "But questions are easier to manage than uncertainty." Charles smiled faintly. His sister had always possessed an extraordinary ability to simplify complicated issues, and continued. "William has earned greater responsibility. He already carries enormous public expectations. It's only logical that private preparation should eventually reflect public reality." Charles knew she was right. Still, accepting that truth emotionally remained far more difficult than accepting it constitutionally. Later that evening, Queen Camilla joined the king in one of the palace's private sitting rooms. She immediately noticed a folder still resting nearby. "You've spoken with William." Charles nodded. "He took it better than I expected." Camilla smiled warmly. "Of course he did. He's your son." The king looked toward the window. "I sometimes wonder whether preparation feels like confidence or whether it feels like goodbye." Camilla gently reached for his arm. "It depends on how it's presented." Charles remained silent. She continued, "The public doesn't need to see fear. They need to see continuity. The family doesn't need uncertainty. They need honesty." Her words echoed many of Anne's earlier observations. Perhaps everyone around the king had quietly reached the same conclusion long before he had. The next morning, subtle changes quietly began appearing inside palace operations. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible to the public. Yet experienced royal staff noticed them almost immediately. Certain briefing materials now included additional distribution instructions. Several future meetings listed Prince William among expected participants. Security coordination teams updated confidential access schedules. Administrative adjustments appeared routine. But those familiar with palace procedure understood something meaningful had begun. Not a transfer of power, a transfer of preparation. William also noticed the difference. Within days, new documents began arriving at Kensington Palace. Some involved constitutional history. Others summarized national responsibilities usually reserved for senior levels of the monarchy. Each folder represented another step into a future that had always seemed distant. Late one evening, William closed the final document and sat quietly in his study. Outside, the world continued as normal. Inside, everything felt different. For the first time, preparation no longer seemed like something waiting decades ahead. It had already begun. And although neither father nor son could yet imagine how deeply those decisions would affect the royal family, events already unfolding behind palace walls would soon force both men to confront questions far more difficult than either of them expected. The following week, Buckingham Palace appeared as composed as ever. Public engagements continued. Official ceremonies unfolded with familiar precision. The king carried out his constitutional duties, while Prince William attended events across the country with the confidence the public had come to expect. To outside observers, nothing had changed. Behind palace walls, however, a quiet transformation was already underway. William's schedule began, including private constitutional briefings that only a small number of people even knew existed. These meetings weren't designed to replace King Charles. They were designed to ensure that, should the unexpected ever happen, the monarchy would continue without confusion or hesitation. For William, every new meeting carried mixed emotions. Professionally, he understood exactly why the preparation mattered. Personally, each additional responsibility reminded him of something he wished he never had to think about. One afternoon, he arrived at Buckingham Palace for another confidential briefing. As he walked through the familiar corridors, palace staff greeted him respectfully, but something felt different. It wasn't their words. It was their expressions. There was a growing awareness that the Prince of Wales was no longer simply observing the institution. He was becoming more deeply involved in its inner workings. Inside the briefing room, King Charles was already waiting. This time, there were several senior advisors present, along with constitutional experts who regularly worked behind the scenes to ensure the monarchy remained prepared for every possible circumstance. A thick red dispatch box rested on the table. Charles looked toward his son. "Today," he said quietly, "I want you to participate rather than observe." William nodded. The advisors began presenting a series of hypothetical national situations, constitutional challenges, emergency communications, and government procedures requiring rapid coordination between the sovereign and senior officials. None of the scenarios reflected current events. They were exercises, practice, preparation. As the discussion continued, William surprised everyone in the room. Rather than focusing only on protocol, he repeatedly asked about the people affected by each decision. How would families experience this? What reassurance would the public need? How do we maintain confidence without creating unnecessary concern? Several advisors exchanged approving glances. Charles noticed them. For years, he had watched his son grow into public service. But hearing William approach constitutional responsibility with compassion rather than authority reminded him that the future of the monarchy might rest in capable hands after all. When a meeting ended, most of the advisors quietly left. Only father and son remained. Charles walked toward one of the palace windows overlooking the gardens. I've spent much of my life preparing for responsibilities that seemed impossibly far away. William joined him. So have I. The king smiled faintly. The difference is, I never fully understood the emotional cost until I reached this point. William looked across the gardens. Neither did I. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, William broke the silence. I don't want people thinking this preparation means you're stepping aside. Charles immediately turned toward him. Neither do I. Then we should make that clear. The king nodded. Preparation should strengthen confidence, not create speculation. It was a simple agreement, but an important one. Both men understood that perception could shape public opinion just as powerfully as reality. Over the following days, rumors slowly began circulating among royal commentators. Reports suggested that William had become increasingly involved in confidential palace matters. Newspapers questioned whether the prince was taking on a broader advisory role. Television panels debated whether the king's recent decisions reflected careful planning or something more significant. The palace declined to comment on specific internal procedures. That silence only fueled further speculation. Meanwhile, Catherine watched the growing media attention with quiet concern. One evening, she joined William in the library after another unusually long day. You've hardly stopped working. William smiled. I suppose that's becoming normal. She noticed several confidential folders stacked neatly across the desk. Do you ever wish things had stayed simpler? William thought carefully before answering. Sometimes, but I also know none of us choose the roles we're born into. He paused. We only choose how we carry them. Catherine smiled proudly. That's one of the reasons people trust you. Elsewhere inside Buckingham Palace, Queen Camilla noticed another subtle shift. During several official discussions, senior advisors increasingly looked toward William for his perspective before final recommendations were presented to the king. Charles welcomed the contributions. He encouraged discussion. Yet Camilla quietly recognized what few outsiders could see. Preparation was gradually becoming routine, not because authority had changed, because confidence had grown. Several days later, Princess visited Windsor for a private family lunch. Unlike formal palace meetings, this gathering included no officials and no advisors. Just family. Conversation eventually returned to the subject everyone had carefully avoided discussing publicly, and looked directly at William. How are you handling everything? William answered honestly. I'm learning. She smiled. Good, because learning never stops. Charles laughed softly. That's certainly true, and then turned toward her brother. You've done something important. Charles raised an eyebrow. I've created paperwork, and shook her head. No, you've created certainty. The room fell quiet. She continued. The strongest institutions aren't the ones that avoid change. They're the ones that prepare for it together. Her words stayed with everyone long after lunch had ended. That weekend, King Charles and Prince William appeared together during a public engagement. Photographers captured dozens of images. Commentators immediately analyzed every gesture, every smile, every conversation. To the public, they looked united, confident, comfortable, exactly as father and son should. Only they truly understood everything that had taken place behind closed doors. As the engagement concluded, Charles quietly placed a hand on William's shoulder before greeting the crowd. It lasted only a second. Most people barely noticed. But for William, it carried enormous meaning. It wasn't simply encouragement. It was trust. The king no longer viewed preparation as something to hide. William no longer viewed it as something to fear. Both had reached the same understanding. Serving the monarchy wasn't about one generation replacing another. It was about ensuring each generation supported the next before history demanded it. As they walked back toward the palace together, the cameras continued flashing. The public saw a reigning king and his heir. The royal family saw a father and son, and behind every photograph taken that day remained one quiet truth. The confidential document signed weeks earlier had never been about ending one reign. It had always been about protecting the future of the crown while strengthening the present. Neither man could predict what history would eventually bring, but they had made one decision together. Whatever challenges awaited the monarchy in the years ahead, they would face them not through secrecy or uncertainty, but through preparation, trust, and the unbreakable bond between a father determined to protect his legacy and a son determined to honor it. The British royal family has always reminded the world that its greatest decisions are rarely made in front of cameras. Sometimes the most important moments happen behind closed doors, long before history ever records them. Whether this reported royal preparation becomes a defining chapter of King Charles's reign or simply another quiet step in Prince William's journey, one thing is certain. The future of the monarchy continues to capture the attention of millions around the world. What do you think? Was King Charles right to begin preparing Prince William for greater responsibilities now? Or should these decisions remain completely behind palace walls until absolutely necessary? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so share your opinion in the comments below. If you enjoyed this royal story and want more fascinating updates, exclusive analysis, and in-depth discussions about King Charles, Prince William, Princess Catherine, Queen Camilla, and the future of the British monarchy, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest videos. If you found this story interesting, give it a thumbs up and share it with friends who enjoy following the royal family. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next royal update.